Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, President and Founder of SMIE Consulting, and we'll be talking to you over the next 30 minutes or so with our takes on three important news stories from this past week, and we're hoping you are able to join us in this lively discussion on three topics. The first of which is Operation Varsity Blues that broke last week, but we'll take a look at it from an international student perspective or an international perspective to see how the two kinds of events compare. We'll then take a look at the UK and their new international education strategy that rolled out this past month, and we'll look at some of the details of what they are prioritizing over the next few years. And then we'll finish up with something that I think is important for international institutions, internationally minded institutions to think about, and that has to do with, particularly those working with agents, it has to do with your own agent training. How do you do it? British Council has launched an updated online agent training program, and we'll take a look at what that means for the UK and how that can be modeled by US institutions. So we'll take a look at those three topics and more, and we'll take a look at hopefully get some of your feedback on what these issues can mean for your institutions. So thanks again for joining me. Just to recap, for those who are new to the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup, we go live every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we share three news stories each week that we pull from our SMIE Consulting e-newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and that goes live every Monday morning Eastern Time. And I'm putting a link to this past Monday's newsletter that has all the stories that we're covering today are profiled in that newsletter with the kind of short takes, quick takes, hot takes on how we think these news stories can be adapted by institutions to hopefully benefit your international education enrollment strategies. So thank you for joining me for that. Again, if you want to subscribe, you can follow the link in the newsletter to the subscribe page and get yourself added to that list so you're kept up to speed on everything that's going on with regards to these news stories that we cover each week here on the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. So appreciate you being a part of the conversation today. And I always like to add in the links to our podcast and the SMIE Consulting website, which are available for you, obviously, free of charge. The podcast of this live chat is uploaded Wednesday afternoons on all your favorite podcasting platforms. So on iTunes, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, and Stitcher. You'll be able to catch all the past episodes going back to July of the Midweek Roundup, the live chat. So please, thank you for joining me today for this. And let's jump right into the first story. And we talked about Operation Varsity Blues kind of tangentially last week at the end of the show, because the story had just broken the day before, and really was all anybody could see, even in non-international ed circles. Certainly all anyone saw on the news during the past few days. And certainly we're seeing a lot of these stories popping up again, how it's impacting certain different sectors in education and different student groups that might be negatively impacted by what Varsity Blues is doing or has done, the Operation Varsity Blues. And I start today with this topic for perspective more than anything else. Yes, it's the stories seem to be all over the news last week about how it's basically a privilege thing that these Hollywood actors are paying to get, and wealthy business owners and venture capitalists are paying to get their sons and daughters into prestigious institutions in the United States. Newsflash, this has been going on for many, many years. The fact that it's just come to now into a nationwide sting is certainly grabs the attention, the headlines, but really the reality is this kind of thing has been going on for years, whether with sports teams, whether with again, wealthy individuals trying to do whatever it takes by making donations to institutions to get their children into the best schools. Whether or not that does any good, it's a degree on their record perhaps, so that's why they do it. Now, Why are we taking a look at this from the international perspective? Well, on the same day, and this is interesting the way this all transpired, on the same day in California that U.S. attorneys certainly rounded up Hollywood actresses as well as some prominent college consultants, that there was also a sting going on in L.A., and the Bay Area actually, where 5 California residents on Tuesday were arrested for helping Chinese nationals obtain student visas by taking English tests for them. This is just, I think, from an international story perspective, is the tip of the iceberg. This is a fairly, well, certainly not, if not in China, not here in the United States, certainly in other countries, in China especially, India as well. There are regular stories of abuses of the system here, and this is a bit that I think, in terms of what was highlighted with this particular story in California, the 5 California residents were accused of helping over 40 students who took advantage of this scheme, whereby students other than the students who came to the United States took English proficiency tests for students, SATs, that kind of thing, so that they could achieve passing scores and be admitted. And this is certainly something that has been going on for many years. But the charges, it was a 26-count indictment handed down by a federal grand jury, and that students used, the ones who took the tests were using false passports, conspiring to use false passports, aggravated identity theft, to impersonate Chinese nationals in order to take the TOEFL. So the TOEFL obviously is one of the exams that many international students take if they're looking to come to the United States to get their visas and such. So this one gentleman was alleged to have paid for 14 Chinese nationals to take the exams by using fraudulent documents. And so this is really interesting to see how these fraudulent acts were caught and were allowed to. Oh well, these fraudulent acts allowed several students, 40 students, to cheat their way, according to the article, into universities across the country, including a couple of UC schools, Arizona State, University of Alabama, and others. So we're looking at this kind of an abuse of the system as something that is very common internationally, and certainly anyone who follows news on SAT and ACT tests abroad, how many times those have been canceled or postponed, or test scores invalidated from exams because of security concerns, because students had gotten the exam answers from hacked the system and gotten answers, or were having other people take their tests. So the levels of abuse when it comes to testing internationally are frankly just not even scratching the surface in terms of what is really are some of the issues internationally. That international students, their parents, their agents that they work with in some countries, to the lengths to which they will go to achieve admission and entry into the United States under having taken submitted false documents, taken testing, having essays written for them, transcripts forged, all of these things, and bank records forged. These are just some of the many ways that international education is well behind, is well ahead of the curve in terms of the frequency and the volume of cheating that goes on. And I've just posted a link to another story out of the Bay Area in San Francisco, and appropriately titled, Admissions Experts Say Operation Varsity Blues is Nothing Compared to International Cheating. It basically focuses on one person who is the founder of Ivy Advisors. She talks about her experience. So she used to work exclusively for high school students and their parents in the admissions process, and talks about some of the unethical activities that they wanted to pursue to get their sons and daughters in. But she really switched to working with MBA students, prospective MBA students. This is really really where she changed her business model to working with them recently, because she thought it was a less fraught with ethical challenges and debates. But the article's basically her. There's no one else really that is interviewed for it. But she goes on to say that the U.S. is one of the most ethical countries I've seen, quote unquote. I think it's built with the right values, but internationally, where corruption might be the norm and bribery is common, you have the worst cases. And that is true to a large extent, because as she says, you can think of countries where people might look alike. They just pay somebody to test for you and ghostwrite your application, and that happens. That happens regularly in certain countries. And she is right on point in terms of how significant of an issue this is overseas. One thing I would just comment on is that these kinds of stories, and it's sad to say, are almost too common for international educators in what they hear every day, what they experience on a year-to-year basis from prospective students. I touched on the story last year of a time, probably 5 years ago, where I was doing some application reading for a selective institution, and they had a number of students. This was just as the China boom was taking off. It's actually about 10 years ago now, where the China boom was starting to take off for American institutions. And I personally read applications from one school, one international section of a Chinese national school, that 6 applications over a period of 2 to 3 days from the same high school that had exactly the same essay, maybe one thing different on activities, and many of the transcripts were nearly identical. Then that's not uncommon in terms of the courses that they take, but the grades were identical in each of those classes. Clearly a case where an agent who was supporting those students, sending the applications in, had fabricated nearly everything that was a part of their student application. So that's common, unfortunately, and increasingly common, it seems. Now that with Operation Varsity Blues, certainly that's raised the profile of these kinds of activities, but certainly has done nothing unusual for international educators in terms of what we see on an all too frequent basis. So that's a little bit on that Operation Varsity Blues, and certainly we'll have more in the weeks and months to come as that story develops and perhaps unveils some other hidden secrets of international education in the United States. But we will turn now to a country that has had its ups and downs over the past few years related to international education, and that's in the UK. They are coming up on a very inauspicious deadline for Brexit, where they will be parting ways with the European Union and all the various benefits that has led to over the past 2 decades in terms of integration, in terms of free access and movement of peoples, and education is certainly be a central component of the European Union, the Erasmus Agreement, and many other related programs. But the UK has weathered a lot of storms, as do all universities or all institutions, all countries that are involved in international education. There are ebbs and flows. No matter where you are in the world, you're never going to be always on the up. In the United States, we've experienced down periods, certainly post 9/11, and we're in the middle of one now, post 2016 elections. Talked a little bit about the implications of that for U.S. higher ed on previous episodes of this podcast and live chat. But with the UK, they're dealing with Brexit and what that means for their relationships with EU institutions right now. But they've seen a lot of institutions that have been forward-thinking, have seen it coming, and have expanded their institutional recruitment efforts in other markets outside the EU, knowing that there is likely to be some drop-off in EU numbers at their institutions. So they've been investing heavily in China, in Vietnam most recently, and other countries, Brazil and Latin America, that have been increasingly under the watchful eye of British universities. But now we see something happening in the UK with this article I've just posted the link to in the comments section on the Facebook page. We see something that, frankly, in the US, we're quite envious of. and that's a national international education strategy, something that the government in the UK, the Education Secretary and the International Trade Secretary in the UK, as part of the Conservative government there, have put together a number of measures to boost the international education sector in that country. And that they've had to set some really ambitious targets. And some of the issues that we've addressed in past episodes are related to post-study work in England, in the UK, and what that is. And they've done some extensions in this white paper that was released recently to give bachelor's and master's graduates 6 extra months of work permission, and PhDs a year extra post-study work leave. So that's along with a number of funds and grants that have been developed to promote the UK internationally for its educational institutions, are certainly welcomed from British universities. And they have an ambitious goal to increase their international student numbers from a current 458,000 to over 600,000 in the next 10 years, and are hoping to add more than 15 billion pounds a year to the UK economy, over and above the 20 billion they currently receive each year as a result of international students studying in the UK. So it does have parts of the strategy that are focused on retaining links with European institutions, but really the focus is on expanding the education sector's profile internationally, and parts of South and East Asia, Africa, and Latin America are specifically mentioned. They talk about English language training being a focus of their Latin American outreach. They're looking at partnerships higher ed partnerships in Vietnam. There was a big article a couple of weeks ago on that, and on the number of institutions and British organizations that signed agreements with institutions in Vietnam. So obviously the UK has a built-in advantage in that respect, in that the federal government does have a policy in place and actually thinks about these things, and having a policy to promote the U.S. as a brand educationally, or UK as a brand overseas. And that's something that we just don't have a cohesive national policy here in the United States. There's the Department of State through Education USA, and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs has its own mission through public diplomacy to build ties and improve mutual understanding as their stated outreach goal. You have the Department of Commerce that is really focused on building partnerships and financial partnerships between U.S. institutions and businesses overseas. They sometimes work at cross purposes, and occasionally they might come together for certain events and supporting certain policy decisions. But there's never been a combined universal policy for the United States when it comes to international education. And that's something that we certainly wish we had. International educators, to a person in the U.S., would say, yes, absolutely, we want something like that, something we can hang our hat on when we travel abroad, that allows us to really carry the flag for higher education in the United States. But what the UK are doing is certainly smart in the wake of Brexit coming up, and what that means, a no-deal Brexit in particular. Who knows whether that's actually going to happen? They might get their exit delayed for a couple months, who knows. But they are at least making concrete plans to improve their standing internationally. So I'll keep an eye on that for you, and certainly advocacy is an important piece in the United States in terms of is some tool that we all have as international educators. And I know colleagues from around the country were in D.C. Monday and Tuesday this week for Advocacy Day sponsored by NAFSA, and kudos to all of you who went out and met with your state or your national legislatures in the Congress. That's always an important time every year and throughout the year, maintaining those relationships with your elected leaders. And we certainly encourage all of you to be doing that, whether through NAFSA or other organizations, through your own grassroots efforts locally. How well are you maintaining your ties with your congresspeople? That makes a difference in terms of advocating for change at the national level, in terms of funding for educational and cultural affairs in the State Department or other exchange programs. There's so much that we can do, and that in even through the toughest of times, international education, even post 9/11, international education was seen as a white hat issue. That means that it has bipartisan support. And this is always something that if we don't advocate for it, it kind of falls behind priority-wise. And it's certainly something that educators need to be taking a lead on in fighting the good fight for what we do. And that's something I certainly advocate for everybody. So wish we could do what the Brits are doing and have an organized national policy, but that's a long way off here. I do want to conclude with something today that is something I've experienced personally with the previous institution I worked at, and that's agent training. I inherited a system at the last institution I worked at where the previous director had only worked with agents, and there were never contracts. There was only letters that they used to say what the agreements were. We'll pay you X amount if you send us a student. So that was a challenge I had going into my last institutional job. And one of the decisions and one of the tasks I was given was really to get the agent situation under control, where we had over 2,500 agents at one point that we had agreements with, or letters where we said we'd work with you. And that is clearly not manageable in any stretch of the imagination. So what we did is we decided, okay, what do we need to focus on with our agents? Obviously getting them to understand our processes, getting to understand not only the admissions process, but scholarship and work opportunities, but also the visa process. So those were three areas that we identified as priorities for our agents to understand how we did things. So we did a series of online trainings that were required attendance for any agent who wanted to continue with us. They had to attend these trainings. So these were all live sessions that we did that we also made available offline or on demand to all of the agents who wished to participate. And after this training, we narrowed down from well over 2,500 agents that were in the mix to a list of about 160, still way too many, with the goal of getting it under 100 in a year, and we got there. But we got there by holding our agents to account and making sure that they were trained on our processes and procedures. And that was something that we wouldn't have been able to do that without having online training, because our agents were scattered so far and wide, and we had to prioritize, obviously, where we were going to spend our time. And the British Council has done something very similar. They have actually had an online training platform for agents since 2017, December 2017, through the online platform FutureLearn. But obviously there's been a lot of changes in the UK over the last few months and years, and what they've done now is they've updated their online agent training platform. They've extended that and added new pieces to address implications of Brexit and some of the changing landscape for international education in the UK and British Council's role there. And as you might know, British Council has in each country there are lists of approved agents that British institutions can work with. These are vetted by and a complete training that British Council provides in order to get on their lists. So there is that is going on, and certainly it's anyone who wishes to promote the UK institutions and to be recognized by the British Council has to complete this training. So it's really a critical piece. The British Council, obviously UK institutions have been using agents for many years, and this is they've developed now a system, a fairly mature system of how to become a fully certified British Council agent for students. So that's something that certainly there are models in the U.S., particularly through ARC and ISEF have training programs. ARC has certification programs for agents where they can go through that process to become certified through ARC, paying a certain fee, to have their businesses analyzed and approved to get on the ARC list. ISEF does trainings regularly for agents, in addition to the many workshops that they conduct around the world for agent and institutional speed dating, if you will. But the reality is, in this day and age, for those institutions that are using agents as part of their international recruitment efforts, it's really incumbent upon them to take the time to fully vet and train any agents that are going to be representing you in country. in markets where you want to be establishing a presence. And certainly online training is an important way of broadening your scope in terms of the ability to reach a wider range of individuals that might be representing your institution. There's only so much you can do in a given year to visit agents in every country and every location that you might be working with, but certainly online training is something I've certainly used successfully at my last institution to get some quality control going with regards to the agents our institution was working with at the time. But it's certainly something I'd be curious to hear your feedback and comments on what you've done with agent training. It's certainly one of many tools that U.S. institutions can use and do use regularly to reach their international audiences. And Austin, how you doing there down in Columbus? Hope all's well for you at OSU. Good to see you there. Hope you're well. And looking forward to catching up with you down the road sometime. We certainly are eager to hear your feedback on the educational agent situation, as well as any of the topics we covered today. For those, again, who are looking to catch up with past editions of the Midweek Roundup, you can find those on our Facebook page here. Also, our YouTube channel for SMIE Consulting has each of the editions going back to July when we launched the Midweek Roundup last year. We have all those archived for you there, as well as I mentioned earlier, through podcasts. So hope you're able to catch up with us one way or another, and certainly subscribe to our SMIE Consulting e-newsletter, all the SMIE news fit to share. Happy to be bringing this to you each week, and look forward to catching up with you again next time. Have a wonderful day, and see you around.